Afternoon. So this morning I spoke about anti-fragile systems, but we also get anti-fragile ideas and tools. They follow the same definition. They have a small downside and a big upside. As I mentioned this morning, I have always been fascinated about tools that can help us improve our decisions, both the speed and the quality of decisions. The quality of a decision is based on coming up with an answer or a solution that has more upside than downside. There are very, very few ideas that has no downside. Almost every idea has some kind of downside. So as Professor Chung mentioned, we have these thinking processes in theory of constraints. They are quite complicated, they take quite a long time, and they frequently don't give us breakthroughs. So I've always been trying to find ways of making them much simpler, but also much better. And this is what I would like to present to you today. I will start off with sharing with you the process that Dr. Goldratt left with us, a very simple method, just 2 steps of how you can make breakthroughs in any area that you are passionate about. I will then show you the giants on whose shoulders I have tried to stand with the new developments. So any scientific breakthrough, in the words of Isaac Newton, I can see so far because I am standing on the shoulders of giants. You always have to pay respect to those people whose ideas you've investigated. You have found that those ideas have some benefits, but also some limitations, and you have tried to address those limitations. I'll then present a new method I've developed that in many cases, maybe even most cases, it can replace all the other thinking process tools before it. The current reality tree, future reality tree, evaporating cloud, prerequisite tree, etc. And then I'll present you with some examples. We have not much time left, so I'll only select a few examples and show you how we use this method also in other types of applications. So let's start. Imagine this box represents all the decisions that you make every day. And I'm sure you will agree with me that there are many decisions that we make every day about which route we will take to get to the office, about what we will change today and what we won't change today. If we are lucky, a portion of those decisions are good decisions. What do we mean by good? Is they are useful, they help us go closer to our goals. But also, there are some bad decisions that we make. Either bad because they didn't help us and we ended up wasting scarce resources, or they actually made things worse. So when you're trying to understand why do we make bad decisions, you realize that some bad decisions are simply unavoidable. Essentially, we will never know the answer. Imagine you are responsible for forecasting the weather in Seoul tomorrow. You must live with the fact that probably you are going to be wrong at least 10% of the time. So there are some decisions that are unavoidable. If you are responsible to forecast the demand for a new product or service, you just have to accept that a significant portion of the time you will be wrong. But there are many avoidable mistakes that we make, and those can be categorized into 3 reasons, 3 causes. Ignorance, either I didn't know that there was a problem or I didn't know the solution. Inertia, which is I knew the problem, I even knew the solution, but I did not act. I decided not to take an action. And then the last category, which is called ineptitude, which is I knew, I acted, but I made some kind of compromise. I didn't implement the solution fully, and as a result, I only got partial results. And the question I started asking is that most of the mistakes that we make, is it because of ignorance, we didn't know? Or is it because of inertia and ineptitude? Well, it's a much easier problem to solve if it's ignorance. Why? Think about these common mistakes we make. We do things that we know we shouldn't. We overeat, we snack continuously. We may have some bad habits, we smoke and drink. We spend too much sometimes, more than what we earn, and we go into debt. And we stress too much. So if we do these things because of ignorance, it should be very simple to solve it. Simply tell yourself or whoever's doing this to stop. Right? And if they don't stop, just educate them more. Tell them how bad it is for them if they continue to do it. On the other side, we also make mistakes of not doing things that we know we should. We should eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. We should save more. We should appreciate more the things that we have rather than worry about the things that we don't have. And of course, we should exercise more. And again, the solution is very simple. Start doing those things. And if people don't, then just educate them more. This is the same type of assumption that governments have. If they want you to stop smoking, what do? They print big warnings on the cigarette packets to warn you about the damage that smoking does to you. Now, you have to ask yourself, is there still somebody out there in the world that are ignorant about the negatives of smoking or the positives of stopping? And my conclusion was, probably not. That's not the problem. And yet, we try to solve the problem as if it is ignorance, as if people don't know, and even if they do that, they want to be reminded. So education in most cases is not the answer, simply because the problem is not ignorance. There are unplanned pregnancies at the school, not because the children don't know that sex is bad for them, that it can result in unplanned babies. It's because of other reasons. So we can look at the same problem at work. We keep on multitasking, we keep on discounting our products, we keep on ignoring the customers, we keep on making too much stuff. Is it because we are ignorant? Or is it rather because of inertia or ineptitude? Inertia, we know it's a problem, but for some reason we don't act. Either because of some kind of exaggerated fear or frustration. So I mentioned Dr. Goldratt tried to show us how to apply the scientific method to solve any problem that we are passionate about. In fact, in the foreword of his classic book, The Goal, he actually shows us the 2 steps. He says applying the scientific method is very simple. Step 1 is simply having the courage to face inconsistencies. An inconsistency is simply a gap between what we expect to see and what we do see, between reality and what we like to see. And the second step is challenging basic assumptions. If there's a gap between my current situation and what I would like to see, there could only be one of 2 bad assumptions. Either my expectation was too high, or the actions which I took to realize that expectation was wrong. So I realized as I was reading through this that all the thinking processes of TOC, of theory of constraints, as well as any other thinking processes like the 5 why process, root cause analysis, they have a single objective, which is to find a bad assumption. And that's how I started this, to say, what is the simplest possible process that we could follow to find out what is our bad assumptions? So I started looking at the tools that we use on a daily basis that helps us make better decisions. Benjamin Franklin was the first one to propose such a method in the late 1700s. A friend of his came to him and said, "Benjamin, I need your help. I am thinking about changing my job. What is your recommendation?" And he said to him, "Look, I can't give you advice about what to do, but I can give you advice on the method I use myself for making these tough decisions, which is you simply take a page, you draw a line in the middle, and on the one side you write all the positives of the change that you are thinking about, and on the other side all the negatives. And once you have written them down, you give yourself some time, a few days, you will see that there are positives and negatives, and then you kind of do a mental arithmetic by cancelling the one off against the other. And the one that has the fewest left remaining, that should be your choice." That method has got clearly some benefits, but it also has some limitations. For example, if I have a list that have 20 positives that I've written down and only one negative, what does it mean? It either means that clearly this is a change that I should be doing because there's much more positives than negatives, or it shows us that we have a massive bias towards making the change, and that we should take time to think about other negatives. We know that there must be other negatives, else we wouldn't have procrastinated to have made the change. So that's one of the big benefits, and it doesn't help us to just do this in our head. We should actually write it down over a few days to give ourselves an opportunity to think of all the possible benefits, the positives and negatives. Dr. Goldred came around and realized, but there's two other dimensions that this method ignores. He created something, it's kind of like a Procon list on steroids, Procon square maybe. He said maybe what we should do is not only look at the positive and the negative of the change, the positive, which is the pot of gold at the top of the mountain that we have to climb up, or the negatives, which is the crutches representing the cost of climbing up the mountain and the pain that we will experience if we fall down and break our leg. Maybe the thing that is blocking us from making the change is that there's also a positive and negative of not changing. And he created this simple storyline where he said, imagine at the bottom of the mountain there's a big alligator, and the alligator is going to eat you up. It's very big, it's got sharp teeth, and if you don't run up the mountain, even if there wasn't a pot of gold on the top, it would have still given you enough pressure to run up the top of the mountain. That is the negative of not changing. What will happen to you if I don't change? Like in the example, what will happen to me if I don't stop smoking? But there's also a positive of not changing. And this he created in the storyline, a beautiful mermaid that you have to leave behind. She's beautiful, you're in love with her. For a woman in the room, you can imagine a merman. Apparently there is such a thing as a merman. So big, beautiful guy that you don't want to leave behind, but they don't have legs, so you can't carry them with you up the mountain. This represents the kind of things that we are scared of losing when we make a change. Let me give an example. We get a new computer system. We expect everybody to be very happy because they are getting a new computer system. There's a big alligator currently in that the old computer system doesn't work anymore. It frequently shuts down, it crashes, etc. That's the alligator. The pot of gold at the top of the mountain, after we've implemented the change, which in this case is a new computer system, is that we will all be much more efficient, we will look more professional, etc. What's the crutches? Well, that represents the cost and the effort of actually implementing this change. And we know Later on, I will speak about SAP, for example. We know that whether you are implementing a big IT system like SAP or Oracle or Microsoft, it normally costs much more than what you think. So it could be that the cost outweighs the benefit. So the crutches is the cost of climbing up the mountain, implementing the change, or the risk of falling down and it doesn't work. But what is the mermaid? What is the positive of not making the change? The type of thing that people could be afraid of that they will lose, that could explain why they would resist such a good change. Imagine you have been with a company for 20 years, you're an absolute expert in the current IT system, and suddenly the company implements a new IT system. What are you afraid of losing? At the moment, you are the expert. It has taken you 20 years to become the expert. Imagine what happens if a new IT system is implemented. You become a novice. You're as inexperienced as the young person that have just started their job. And so using this framework is a very simple framework of being able to highlight the type of fears that we might have that sometimes causes us to resist good changes and sometimes causes us to implement bad changes because we might be exaggerating how big the alligator is or how big the pot of gold is. So it was a very simple evolution of the Procon list that brought with it lots of benefits. But there are also some limitations with this method. What happens if I've written everything down and I'm still stuck? And Dr. Goldratt developed a method which he called an evaporating cloud, which helps you to resolve conflicts by challenging assumptions. So you're not trying to compare whether the pot of gold is bigger than the mermaid or the crutches is bigger or smaller. What you're trying to do is you're trying to write down the assumptions and see if you could challenge the assumption. Because by removing a bad assumption, you are in fact removing a conflict. So what I did was, I thought, well, what if we just combined these methods into a simple tool, and I called it, out of respect for the people that, for Dr. Goldratt that created it, the Change Matrix Cloud. It's a combination of these three methods. It brings us the benefits of the change matrix, which is an evolution of Benjamin Franklin's method, by showing us all four forces that can influence a change, from my perspective and the perspective of other stakeholders. But it also gives us the benefit of the cloud technique to look at specific assumptions that need to be challenged and can be challenged. So what does it look like? For example, if I was considering stop smoking versus continue smoking, start exercising versus not to start exercising. This helps me to list out all the assumptions. But as I mentioned, what if all these assumptions look real to me? And there's no obvious way to compare them or to eliminate them. This is where we need the technique of the cloud. And what I did was, I started thinking about the common mistakes that we can make in each step of the process. So I went back and said, a conflict comes from a problem. What is the mistake that we can make with a problem? Is that we are wasting time on a problem that we shouldn't have wasted time on. So step one in the process should be, write down the problem that you are facing, the expectation gap, and then do a very quick check of why this problem is bad for me or my part of the organization, and why it is bad for the total organization. If you say yes, yes, you know you are dealing with an important problem. Now you can go to the next step. The next step simply says what to change. Now tell me the conflict that you face in dealing with this problem. What is the action or the change that you feel pressure to make to get rid of the problem? So if I'm overweight, why is this bad for me? Because it negatively influences my confidence that I have. Why is it bad for others? Is my children are embarrassed when we go to the beach and I have to wear my bathing costume and I have this big belly, right? So what do I feel pressure to do? As I feel pressure to start exercising. That's the change. Or I feel pressure to go on a diet. Why haven't I done that? Because there's also pressure not to do it. This is the not change part or the status quo. So now I kind of understand why I haven't solved the problem yet. It's not because of ignorance of how bad it is. It's simply because I'm stuck in a conflict. There's inertia. If I want to see why am I stuck, I then go to the next step that says, let me first write down the reasons I might have to change. There are two reasons why I should change. The first reason is the crocodile. This is the negative of not changing. What will happen to me if I continue not to exercise, if I continue to overeat? These are current undesirable effects that I experience. The second reason for change is what would be the positive if I do change. The pot of gold at the top of the mountain. How will I feel once I lose all the weight? How proud will I feel? How proud will my children and spouse feel about me? The second step is to write down the two reasons for not changing. These are the fears that we have. For example, that I have to give up something. I really love eating, right? And I'm scared of giving up that pleasure. Life is so complicated, so stressful, that the only pleasure I still have is to really enjoy eating. So I will write in there is the plus or the positive of not changing is that I can keep on enjoying food as much as I want. Or I can keep on eating chocolates, or I can keep on drinking or smoking because it, for example, helps me to deal with stress. And then the crutches. What am I afraid of could happen if I simply stop smoking, for example, or if I simply started exercising? Maybe I won't have enough time to do the kind of things that I also need to do, to spend time with my family or more time at work. What am I scared of if I stop smoking? Maybe I'm scared that I will gain weight. So it's a very simple technique to quickly write down the assumptions that could be blocking us. Either I have some kind of exaggerated frustration about how big the alligator is, and maybe it's not that big, or how big the pot of gold is. And by writing it down, I can ask myself, really, is this really true? The second reason is I could have some kind of exaggerated fear of having to give up something I already have and think that there's no way I can keep it, or the fear of gaining something I don't want and I don't have. And the last step in the process is to simply write down what is my goal, and am I sure that these two positives will help me get to my goal. So I'm using the goal almost as a way of checking that this is really important to me. And then writing the opposite of the goal, the threat that I have, in this case just being unhappy, will either of these really make me unhappy? Will it really harm me? I hope that makes sense. Just a very symmetrical way of looking at the upside of the change versus not change, and the downside of the change and not change. And that's what step 2 is all about, is to really identify the conflict that I'm stuck with. So what is step 3? Is to find out what to change. And what I realize is that when we make a decision, and as I mentioned, we make many decisions every day, we only really resolve conflicts in one of 4 ways. The first way I called change plus plus. So, I've decided to still go for the change. For example, I'm going to stop smoking, but I have to add 2 things to it. Those are represented by the 2 pluses. If, for example, I thought that the plus of smoking is that I have a good way of dealing with stress, unless I add something to this change that allows me to deal with stress, like I will stop smoking and start jogging, because jogging is also a good way of dealing with stress, I only have a half-baked solution. The second thing I will have to add, which is represented by the second plus, this is a kind of a risk mitigation strategy, is that if I was afraid that I will gain weight if I stop smoking, I will have to add something to that. Maybe the jogging thing will keep me busy enough, or I will find a way of snacking on something that's maybe healthy, like nuts or fruits or vegetables that won't cause me to pick up weight. And I realized that as we were doing this, is every time we make a decision, when there's a conflict, that's one way that we can resolve the conflict. We're going to say, yes, I'm going to go for the change, but I have to add these 2 things to make sure it's a fully baked solution, not a half-baked solution. Now let's look at the second method. It's identical to method 1, but this time what we're doing is we're saying, is it not possible to solve the conflict by not making a big change? For example, let's keep the legacy system, the old IT system, and I just add something to it to ensure I get most of the pot of gold. That is represented by the first plus. And the second plus is, what must I add to it to make sure that the alligators, the things that people are really complaining about, will go away. So that's a second valid way of resolving a conflict, of going to the other side. And maybe we shouldn't make a big change now, but we can get most of the benefits if we added the following things. That's method number 2, not change plus plus. Method number 3 is a method that we frequently use. It's not selecting one or the other. It's deciding under what condition should we make the change, so when to change and when not to change, and simply writing those conditions. So for example, in a manufacturing facility, work overtime, don't work overtime. When should we work overtime? When we have orders that are about to be late, they are in the red or the black. When should we not work overtime? When we don't have orders in the red or the black, right? When should I centralize, or what should I centralize versus what should be decentralized, is to simply write a rule so that in the future, if anybody faces that conflict, they now have a good rule to decide when to make the change and when not to make the change. And then the last method, which is always the one that's fun, is kind of another change. So forget about the conflict that you have about, for example, reduce the price, not reduce the price. Can you think of any other way that will give you more of the plus, more of the upside, with less or maybe none of the downside, that has nothing to do with pricing or going on a diet or changing your job? And what we encourage people to do is try all 4 methods. And once you've tried the 4 methods, then you can stand back and say, which is the best option? So going back to the idea of anti-fragile, remember, anti-fragile requires that we have options, that we give ourselves alternatives, but then that we have a rational way to select which one is the best. Which one is the best? Simply the one that gives me most upside with the least downside. I hope it makes sense to everybody. We have tested this method with people all the way from 6, 7 years old to people that are 70 years old. The kids, of course, Some of them can't write yet, so they draw pictures. And they see it as a game. See if you can come up with ways of getting more of what you want and less of what you don't want. Come up with as many ideas. Here's 4 ways of coming up with ideas. We have just started a project where we're looking at people that are prisoners when they come in. Is to say, okay, what's the problem? I was arrested, right? Why is that bad for me? Why is it bad for my family? What's the change that I need to make? I need to get out of the gang. Why haven't I? Because I also have pressure to stay in the gang. What is the positive of staying in the gang? I have protection. What's the negative of staying in the gang? I probably am going to get killed, right? Now think about what's the positive of making the change, escaping from it, versus the risk of doing it. And now try the 4 methods and see if you can come up with a solution that has more upside and less downside than the current status quo. Does it make sense to everybody? Okay. So when we look at an overall process, we can start off with many expectation gaps. So select 3 areas of your life that you are unhappy with, that are kind of in the red. I'm unhappy with my weight on the health side. On the wealth side, maybe I'm not climbing up the corporate ladder as fast as I want, or I haven't saved enough for retirement, and maybe my relationship with my spouse is not great. And we simply write down the conflict that I face in dealing with each problem, and then see if there's not something in common. And that's the idea of coming up with a core conflict, kind of a generic conflict that I face in terms of making changes in my life versus resisting changes. And then step 3, using the 4 methods to find a new way, a way that has more upside and less downside. And then I thought, okay, so what have we done here? The first mistake we try to prevent here is working on problems that's not important. We validated that they are important, that it's not ignorance. The second mistake is simply going problem solution rather than realizing that any solution is just one side of a conflict. And that by just jumping to a solution, I'm probably going to create more problems. So treat it as a conflict and see if you can resolve the conflict. That's a problem that we're solving with step 2. Step 3 allows us to expose assumptions that we had by challenging us to use all 4 methods. So I thought, well, what else can block us from implementing good ideas? How many of you have New Year's resolutions that you write down at the beginning of every year? A list of things that you want to achieve this year. Come on, be honest. So few. Wow. Okay. Well, it turns out that most of what we write on the list is the same as what we had on last year's list. Why? Because during the year, we give ourselves fantastic excuses not to start, not to do it, right? We call them politely reservations, concerns, but really they're excuses. I call them yes buts. Yes, I agree that this could resolve my conflict, but. So what I thought was doing as step 4 is to give somebody the ability to raise all the yes buts that they can think of, all the reservations. So we have this new idea now. It's kind of like an injection into our reality that hopefully will have more upside and less downside. What's the yes buts? It could be insufficient to be a win for everybody. Okay, so why isn't it a win for everybody? What is your concern? And what do you think I must add to the idea to make it a win for everybody? So I'm taking the new job. It's not a win for my kids. Why? Because they have to go to a new school. Okay, what can I do to make it also a win for them? Second, yes, but. I like the idea, but it has some negatives for one or more of the stakeholders. What's the negative, and what do I have to add or remove from my idea to overcome that negative? And then the last one, well, there's some implementation obstacles. What is the implementation obstacle? Well, maybe we haven't got a budget yet approved by the board of directors for the new IT system. Okay, what do you need? I need to do a presentation to the board to show them the business case. And from these things, I'm getting additional details, additional requirements. And the more the better. This is essentially the unverbalized fears that people normally won't share. But by explicitly asking them, saying, be as negative as you can, think of all the reasons you can give yourselves or others not to do it. Write them down, but now tell me what you can do to overcome them or prevent it. For example, a yes but is, you know what, I just don't have the self-discipline to train every day. What can I do? Maybe I can get somebody else to train with me. Because it's much easier for me to, if I was on my own, to lie in bed and think, you know what, I don't want to go to the gym today. Versus, I know that my friend is going and that I'll be embarrassed if I don't go. So that's kind of like a little trick that I can use to overcome that yes but. And then the last step in the process, step 5, is to really write down a full summary of what I've done. So the why change is the problem and the impact of not dealing with the problem. This is answering the question when this type of change should be made. What for? What's the objective of the change? I want more upside and less downside. And I write that into this box, which is called the strategy. And I think about how will I measure it? How will I know that I'm actually improving? And then I write down the tactic, which is this new injection, plus any additional changes I've added in order to make it a full solution. And then what was all the assumptions I challenged? Was the assumptions that exposed in the process and all the yes buts that I raised. And now I have a very simple best practice that's easy to communicate to other people, and you might also recognize that it's in the form of a strategy and tactic box for those people that have seen the strategy and tactic tree. So in the presentation, I've included a number of examples. Why some people keep smoking, even though they know it's bad for them. Why we keep multitasking, even though we know it's bad for us. In business, why 50% of patients don't take their medicine as prescribed from a doctor. Can you imagine that? They go to a doctor, the doctor prescribes their medicine, but then they don't take it. Or they take it, but not according to the prescription. They take one a day rather than 2 a day. They take it in the morning, even though the prescription says take it in the evening, after you've eaten. Why? And making a decision about advanced planning. We don't have time to go into each of these, but they are in the slides, and you are welcome if you have any questions to ask. I will quickly show you, just using the software tool that we developed called Harmony, of how this looks, for example. So let's take this one. So the software guides you through the process. The first one, it asks you a question, what's the problem? And in this case, we say 50% of patients do not take their blood pressure medication according to the prescription. Why is it bad for them? Many of the doctor's regular patients are at high risk of getting a heart attack because they are not taking medication properly. And why is it bad for other stakeholders? He lives in constant fear that non-compliant patients will get a heart attack. So what is the conflict that the doctor is facing? The doctor feels pressure to stop treatment of the patients that are not following the prescription. Basically threatening them, that says, I'm going to stop treating you if you don't take the medication exactly as prescribed. At the same time, they also have to adhere to the Hippocratic Oath, which means that you have to treat patients. So this is a very simple way for the doctor to show the positive of the change, the negative of the change, the positive of not changing, and the negative of not changing. But the way that we've developed the process is I can also look at the other side of the problem. Who do I blame for the problem? I can use the same method. So this is the action I feel pressure to take to deal with the problem. This is the action I'm blaming for the problem. Who do I blame for the problem is that the patient continue not to take the medication as prescribed. What do I want the patient to do is to take the medication exactly as prescribed. So when we asked the doctors, and I worked with doctors at a clinic, that this is a real problem, I asked them, why do patients not take medication as prescribed? And I said, we don't know. It doesn't make sense. Every time they come, we tell them the negative of not taking the medication. And we tell them the positive of taking the medication. So I said to them, do you think that they don't know? Because you tell them, their wives tell them, their kids tell them, everybody's telling them. There must be another reason why they don't take the medication. And they said, well, we don't know. I said, well, let's see if this method will help come up with it. And they ended up actually phoning a few patients. And they validated very quickly that the patient know exactly what the alligator is, that they continue to face a high risk if they don't take it as prescribed. And the patient also know exactly what the pot of gold is that they will get better faster. They will have a good life. They can stop worrying, and the spouse and the doctor will stop bitching and moaning with them. What was very interesting is what they wrote as the Mermaid and the crutches. The Mermaid, they wrote, what's the positive of not changing is I avoid the hassle of having to remember. We said, okay, so what can you do about it? And I said, okay, I suppose I can set a little alarm, or if you give me a little pill box that's clearly marked when I should take what, maybe that will help. But that wasn't the real issue. It turns out that the real issue was the crutches. The doctor asked the patient, what are you scared will happen if you take the medicine exactly as prescribed? And quite a few patients said to the doctor, do you know how it makes me feel to take medication every single day of my life? It makes me feel sick and old. I'm 40 years old, I'm 30 years old, I'm 50 years old, I'm not yet old. But taking this medication makes me feel sick and old. And it was a big moment for the doctors, because suddenly they realized why these people would not take it. And the response of the doctor was simply to say to the patient, how many supplements do you think the top athletes are taking every day? A lot. Why did I take it? Not because they're sick and old. It just allows them to live in the most productive way, to be the best that they can be. And that's exactly why you're taking blood pressure medication. It's not because you're sick and old, it simply gives you a better quality of life. So very quickly the method helped the doctor understand something that they never understood, and it was causing massive frustration and disharmony between them and their patients. So this is a simple example, and there are many other examples that are in the notes. So I'll show you one more example and then we'll just end off with some closing remarks. Here the problem was that we don't have a good software tool to plan our very complex operations. So who shared this problem was the planning department. They said that frequently we were late delivering, or we were making too much or too little because we don't have a good software tool to help us. Why was it bad? Because they're not confident that the plan will actually meet the demand. That's why it's bad for them, because that's their prime measurement. And why is it bad for the company? Because the company risks losing sales. So we said, okay, so it's definitely not ignorance. Tell me what's the conflict that you face as a planning department as a result of this problem. They said, we feel pressure to keep on using Excel for the planning. What do you continue to do? What's the current status quo? Is every time we meet with top management, we tell them we need a new computer system. But they say this is getting dangerous. We are worried that they will fire us if we keep on making these demands. So we asked them to write the positives and the negatives and try the 4 methods to resolve their conflict. But then we challenged them to say, who are you blaming? And of course they were blaming the top management for not buying them the new computer system. So I said, what do you want them to have done? Is to have bought it. Now, from the top manager's perspective, write down the positives of the change and not change and the negative of the change and not change. And this gave them deep insight into the conflict that top management was facing. And again, they could use the 4 methods to come up with a good solution. They presented it to top management. Top management gave them quite a few yes buts, but they were able to address it. And at the end of the day, they decided to go for the new software solution. The top manager signed it on condition that all these yes buts were addressed. So these are just few examples. As Professor Chung mentioned, this is the main tool that we use in a program called the Odyssey program, that allows people to look at various aspects of their life, the things that are creating stressful expectation gaps in their life, write down the conflicts, and find very simple solutions that exposes our bad assumptions or limiting assumptions, and come up with a clear action plan on how to address them. We've also used them, for example, with Tata Steel, where we looked at all the big investments that they've made that didn't end up paying the returns that they were expecting, because either the ideas or technologies were not adopted, or they were adopted but they didn't bring value. And this gave them a very simple way of seeing where did it go wrong. So what are some of the lessons that I've learned? When should you use this method? Whenever you face a decision that's important enough that you can justify investing the time to sit down and do it. Like any tool, the first time you'll do it, it'll take a little bit longer because you're learning a new method. What we've found is that when you do it with a group of other people, you learn much faster, because you can help them use the tool on their problem, and from that learn how you can apply it also on your own problem. And that's why when we do the Odyssey program, we always do it in groups. Secondly is that if you just don't understand why you or somebody else are not making changes that you know you should make or that you feel they must make, it's a very good way of putting yourself in that person's shoes, looking at it through their eyes to see why could they be stuck. Is it because some exaggerated fear of losing a mermaid or gaining a crutch? Or is it because of some exaggerated frustration with the current alligators or with not having a pot of gold that could be challenged? Or if you find yourself procrastinating on a decision that you know you should be making. Frequently, the Odyssey program has got young people. Guess what's the number one thing that comes up for young people? Deciding what to go and study. Which of the many things that I can go and study am I going to select? And they know they procrastinate. Or when will I get married? Or when will I start having children? Or when will I go to my boss and tell my boss that I think I deserve a raise? So any decision that you find yourself getting more and more frustrated about, and by waiting longer it's not going to help the situation, it will probably deteriorate the situation, why don't you just sit down and use the method and see if it brings some additional insights? As I mentioned, most often the problem is not ignorance. It's inertia or ineptitude, and this is a very good way of exposing why we are stuck or why somebody else is stuck. I normally supervise a few PhD students at my local university, and what we've seen, it's a very good tool to come up with new hypotheses. So one of my students is a senior executive at a retail bank. He's currently busy with his PhD. The South African government, about 10 years ago, introduced a rule that said that banks have to invest 0.1% of their total profit every year on financial literacy programs, essentially providing people with education that will help them make better financial decisions so that they save more and don't spend so much. 10 years had gone past, and this student of mine, he's an executive at the bank, he is serving on the National Banking Commission. And they did a review of whether the consumer behavior has actually improved. Are people actually saving more? And are they not spending so much? Guess what the outcome was? Zero change. After 10 years of all the financial literacy education, of creating little apps on the smartphones that tell you if you can afford that new car or that new television set, zero change. It was noise. There was no substantial improvement. Guess what the government decided to do? They decided to tell the banks that you are not doing enough. From now on, you should be spending 0.2% of your profit. As if the problem is ignorance. As if the consumers that are making those decisions don't know that they shouldn't be spending so much. So he was frustrated. He said, can I use this method to come up with some additional ideas of why would somebody keep on spending too much money? Why won't they save enough? And immediately he started using it as an interview template. Very simple diagram. He would interview consumers that have been identified as high-risk clients and ask them directly, if you stop spending so much, what's the pot of gold? What's the alligator? Okay, it's not ignorance. Tell me what's the mermaid? What are you afraid of losing if you simply stop spending so much? And what are you afraid of gaining if you stop spending so much? And very interesting things came up. Things like entitlement. I deserve that new car. Yes, I know your app tells me that I can't afford it, but I deserve it. My neighbor has one. I work harder than my neighbor. I'm going to buy it regardless. Now you can imagine, if that's my thinking, that's my assumption, no app in the world that tells me I can't afford a payment is going to convince me otherwise. Whereas if I write it down and I look at it and I go, really? It helps me to overcome. So from a research perspective, it's very useful to come up with some additional hypotheses. I've already shown you how we can use it also to build nodes in a strategy and tactic tree, and the software makes that very easy. You can simply go to the software and click, and it adds it up to the strategy and tactic tree. And then the last one is, we have also been testing it as a kind of I wouldn't like to call it an exam or a test, but a way of checking whether people that we've just communicated a new change in the company, do they actually understand the change? I don't know about your companies, but many of the companies I work with, how do I check if people in the company really understand the change that they are making and agree with it? Guess what they do? They ask the people in the workshop, do you understand the change? And guess what the answer is? Yes. Do you agree with the change? Yes. Do you think that's a reliable way of checking if they really understand and agree? My experience, it's probably the least reliable way. What is another way of checking? Is you ask them to say, please tell me, what problem are we trying to solve with this new change? And why is this problem bad? Tell me what is the change that we've proposed and what's the current status quo. Now tell me the plus and the minus of each side. And if they can clearly fill in that diagram, they know exactly what the change is and they understand what the benefit will be of the change. So it's a very simple way of checking, once you've communicated a change, whether people really understand it and agree on it. And of course, if there are empty boxes, you know that you have done a bad job at communicating it. You need to go back and find a better way of communicating. So, what can block you from using this method? These are some of the yes buts that we frequently hear. We don't have an important enough config to use the tool on. Really? We didn't know that it was actually simple to use. Really? How would you know unless you try it? We understand the tool, but we're a little bit different. Our environment is more complex. It won't work for us. Can you see these are very valid reservations or very good excuses? I agree we should use the tool, but my colleagues at the office won't agree. And then my personal favorite, I agree we should use the tool, but you know what, we just don't have the time now. Maybe next year we'll start using it. So these are the common excuses I give myself, and I'm sure you will give to you. But please check those assumptions and ask yourself, really? Is it really true? Will it really not work? How do I know? Try it. It takes 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes to do. And the more you try it, the faster it will become until you can do it quite successfully in your head. And the really important ones you can do on paper, you can use the software. So thank you very much. And during the break time, we've run out of time because of the delays. But during the break time, I'll be quite happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.